This is week 176 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. I'm gonna be honest, I feel ambivalent about starting every episode for a month straight by saying that Russia has launched a record-breaking attack on Ukraine, and the severe escalation of these attacks is deadly and terrifying. On the one hand, this is the absolute truth. On Wednesday, Russia broke its own record when it launched 741 drones and missiles at Ukraine in a single night, breaking last week's record. The next night, there was a mass attack on Kyiv that our newsroom collectively agreed was one of the loudest we'd ever experienced. From both a statistical perspective and an experiential one, the last month has been among the most deadly and terrifying for Ukrainians since the start of the full-scale invasion over 3 years ago. Russia's goal is to terrorize the Ukrainian people, and they are terrified. For residents of Kyiv, the best protected city in the country, waking up to explosions is now the norm, and quiet nights are becoming the exception. People are making preparations for worst-case scenarios that felt far away a few months ago, whether it's moving beds to the hallway, packing emergency bags before going to sleep, or sending children abroad for their safety. On the other hand, I worry that simply chronicling each new mass attack week after week turns them into a blur, that a record broken one week is easily obscured the next week, and that describing how loud the bangs were or how scared my dog was doesn't do enough to convey just how severe this escalation is for people on the ground. After all, I'm still sitting here. How bad could it be? The duality of the attacks versus daily life makes you feel insane. Everyone stays up all night wondering if the explosions coming closer and closer are going to be the last thing they hear. And then we all go to work in the morning, run errands, hang out with our friends, and go to bed ready for it to happen all over again. This is the reality of living next to Russia, and it's not a matter of resilience. It's a matter of survival. It's helpful to see these attacks visualized. When you compare last year to this year, you see that the total number of drones launched in June of last year is less than the total launched in some single nights in June of this year. Deaths and injuries among children tripled between March and May of this year, compared to the previous 3 months. If this was the year that leaders swore to end the war, the inverse is happening, and Ukrainians are paying the price. It's highly likely that next week I'll be tasked again with explaining yet another chapter in this increasing escalation, and again I'll struggle to find the right words, other than that Russia is a terrorist state, and Ukraine needs your support more than ever. Speaking of support for Ukraine, there have been some updates in that sudden halt of weapons shipments from the US, which stirred panic here in Ukraine and confusion in Washington, as even President Donald Trump himself denied responsibility for the decision. It was reported on Tuesday that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had ordered the halt without informing the White House, along with confirmation that the weapons earmarked for Ukraine did not in any way diminish America's readiness to defend itself. Also on Tuesday, President Trump officially reversed course, directing a resumption of at least certain arms shipments, including Patriot air defense. The next day, the Pentagon confirmed that it would resume some additional deliveries on the president's orders, including ammunitions and rockets deemed necessary for Ukraine's defense. On Wednesday, State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce reiterated that the pause was not a policy shift and reaffirmed unwavering support for Ukraine. One of our headlines this week referred to Ukraine's dealings with Trump as a roller coaster, and amid these increasing air attacks, there's really no better way of putting it. Trump has skewed more pro-Ukrainian in his language in recent weeks, and even went so far as to describe Russian President Vladimir Putin's actions as bullshit at a White House meeting on Tuesday. But his hesitation to implement harsher sanctions against Russia, paired with his administration's habit of pulling the rug out from under Ukraine, despite it meeting all requirements for support, has left the distinct impression that America is not an ally Ukraine can count on in its fight for survival. For the president who vowed to broker peace within 24 hours and then 100 days, a few curses from Trump about the Russian president feel hollow, as explosions echo around Ukraine on a daily basis. In an interview last Saturday, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte claimed that it's most likely that Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping might coordinate large-scale military attacks in the future. In this hypothetical, China would launch a military invasion of Taiwan, while Russia simultaneously launches a direct attack on NATO territory in Europe, detracting from NATO's ability to unilaterally respond to either threat. There are multiple ways that this could play out. The scenario that Rutte initially presented evokes an image of two leaders calling each other up and plotting an exact moment to strike their respective targets. Rutte even outlined an alternative scenario in which Beijing explicitly asks Russia to open up a second front in Europe to wear NATO stocks thin so it's not able to respond to a subsequent invasion of Taiwan. But experts say that the cooperation could be more opportunistic and tacit, rather than a formal agreement. If Russia sees that China is invading Taiwan, it may move opportunistically against Europe without explicit agreement, and likewise, NATO faltering in the face of Russian threats may embolden China to move ahead. Russia and China aren't formally military allies, but they hold deep strategic and economic ties, and have fostered joint military drills. China has claimed to be a neutral party regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but has continued to act as one of Russia's largest trade partners, eschewing Western sanctions and supplying the country with many critical technological components necessary to keep the war machine going. If the two countries can't be called objective allies, they're certainly closer to each other than either is to NATO and the West, and both have a vested interest in unseating the United States as the leading global superpower. Defense officials in the UK and NATO have warned of nightmare scenarios involving simultaneous conflicts in Asia and Europe in the next few years, unless defense spending and readiness sharply improve. Rutte emphasized that NATO must modernize and expand defense spending to deter Russia's immediate threat, thus deterring the wider threat of a multi-pronged world war. Meanwhile, Taiwan is currently undertaking the largest ever version of its annual military exercise, lasting 10 days as opposed to the usual 5, and mobilizing 20,000 reservists for training. This year's exercise is reportedly drawing from Russia's war in Ukraine to create a realistic idea of what is needed to directly counter an invasion: civilian-military cooperation, urban warfare, and the use of drones. If nothing else, may Rutte's warning serve as a grim reminder that failure to definitively stop Russia now will pave the way for catastrophe far beyond Ukraine. If you're wondering what this number on my t-shirt means, I'm happy to explain. It's the total size in square kilometers of Ukraine, including all occupied territories. For my fellow Americans whose brains are also programmed in miles, Ukraine is roughly the size of the state of Texas, or a bit bigger than France, making it the largest country in Europe. We created this t-shirt to send the message that no country is able to redraw international borders at will, and that Ukraine is and always will be the sum of its parts, from Crimea to the Carpathians. There will be a link to our e-store in the description below. And speaking of our e-store, a 15% discount there is just one of the perks you get when you become a member of the Kyiv Independent community. We're a reader-funded news outlet, meaning that shows like this are only made possible by viewers like you. If you'd like to join our community of more than 20,000 members, there will also be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. A series of recent detainments, as well as suicides and accidents among Russian elites, have highlighted once again the lengths that the Kremlin is willing to go to intimidate loyalty from its supporters and exact revenge on its perceived detractors. On July 4th, Andrei Badalov, vice president of Russia's largest state-controlled pipeline transport company, reportedly fell to his death from a window in Moscow. If this plotline sounds familiar, there's a reason. Since February of 2022, at least 7 high-profile Russians have reportedly fallen out of windows to their deaths. These range from a lawmaker who fell from a hotel window after criticizing the invasion of Ukraine, to a musician who reportedly fell from the window of his apartment while it was being searched by Russian security services over an alleged donation to the Ukrainian military. It's become such a common event that commentators often joke darkly that anyone who crosses Putin should stay away from windows. 3 days after Batilov's alleged suicide, Russia's former transport minister Roman Starovoyt allegedly committed suicide by gunshot after being dismissed by Putin. This dismissal came the day after 500 Russian flights were grounded due to Ukrainian drone attacks. Ukrainian military analyst and former security officer Ivan Stupak told the Kyiv Independent that many of these sudden deaths are likely the work of Russia's own security services, whether by brute force or through pressure, by demanding that the individual kill themselves or risk the safety and futures of their families. Suspicion that the Kremlin has orchestrated the deaths of those who displease it far predates the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In 2006, investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya, known for her coverage of Putin's second invasion of Chechnya, was shot dead in the entry of her Moscow apartment building. In 2015, Boris Nemtsov, one of the most vocal oppositionists of Putin's regime, was murdered just steps from the walls of the Kremlin. In 2018, Sergei Skripal, a former double agent for Russia and the United Kingdom, was the subject of an attempted poisoning in the British town of Salisbury, when the plane of former Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin was downed under mysterious circumstances shortly after his failed rebellion against the Russian military in summer of 2023. Few believed that the crash was a spontaneous twist of fate. The mysterious deaths of those who displease the Kremlin are rarely discreet. No matter how suspicious the timing or circumstances, they're written off by the Kremlin as sudden suicides or accidents. In this way, we can understand that these deaths are meant to send a message. When enough high-profile people die under dubious circumstances, it sends a warning to others that no one is above the Kremlin's wrath, and that few explanations need be provided afterwards. If you're a Russian billionaire or politician who's worked your way up through the corrupt system of the last 3 decades, these are not threats that you take lightly. Along with the growing number of mysterious deaths, arrests and detainments are growing among Russia's elite. In the last week, a Russian mining billionaire and a former National Guard officer were both detained on corruption charges. Although their cases aren't related, analysts say that their arrests point not to an anti-corruption reform, but to increasing domestic pressure stemming from Russia's war against Ukraine, which is causing the Kremlin to crack down on what it perceives to be excessive corruption unaccompanied by strict loyalty to the state. In other words, corruption is baked into the Russian system, but you can't get away with it at the highest level unless you're demonstrating loyalty to the Kremlin by its own standards. While some say that this points to a faltering Russian economy, necessitating the seizure and redistribution of powerful figures' assets, Russian journalist and opposition activist Sergei Parhomenko suggested to us instead that the Russian system is simply a sealed vessel, with government and law enforcement and wealth all tied together, in a system that must ultimately devour itself. For our member question this week, I'll be handing it over to my colleague Martin to give me a hand in answering.
Hi, this week we're answering a question from our member Tonko Mulder. Now that the European Court of Human Rights has condemned Russia for the downing of MH17, will the seized Russian assets finally be used for the Ukrainian defense? Unfortunately, the court's ruling is primarily a symbolic victory for Ukraine and has no direct impact on the policy of Ukraine's allies. There were also no recent signals that the G7 members would be willing anytime soon to fully confiscate the 300 billion in Russian assets and send them to Ukraine. That being said, the immobilized assets are already being used to help Ukraine's defense. For example, the EU and the UK are sending some of the profits from the frozen assets to Ukraine's defense needs under the G7's ERA initiative. This basically means that Europe and Britain are buying weapons for Ukraine on a loan that will be paid back by the money generated by the frozen Russian assets. The rest of the funds in this initiative will be directed to Ukraine's recovery needs.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, as much as anyone can enjoy this kind of news, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.